Breaking. NATO just had a heart attack. Trump's 5-day madness nearly destroyed everything 5 days. That is all it took for the world's most powerful military alliance to nearly collapse. NATO didn't just face a crisis, it had a complete cardiac arrest, and the man holding the defibrillator. A president who many are saying has completely lost his mind. What you are about to hear will fundamentally change how you see international politics forever. Because this wasn't just diplomatic tension. This was the closest NATO has come to total destruction since its founding in 1949. And every detail that emerged from those classified briefings makes it even more terrifying. If you want to understand how 5 days of madness nearly ended 80 years of global security, hit subscribe right now. Because what happened behind closed doors makes every spy thriller look like a children's bedtime story. Here is exactly how it all began to unravel. Hour by hour, it started with Greenland. But Trump didn't just suggest buying it. He refused to rule out invasion. Think about that for a moment. The President of the United States, leader of NATO, threatening to invade the territory of a NATO ally. The first calls started at 2:17 a.m. Copenhagen time. Denmark's prime minister was woken by her security advisor with words no democratic leader should ever hear. The Americans are talking about invasion. For 72 hours, that threat hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Denmark's prime minister couldn't sleep. European leaders were making emergency calls at 3 a.m. Security details were quietly doubled. Intelligence agencies activated crisis protocols. And in Downing Street, Keir Starmer was watching America's closest ally prepare for the unthinkable. It was an extraordinary moment, Starmer later revealed. The threat of invasion wasn't just diplomatic pressure. It was a nuclear bomb dropped into the heart of the Western alliance. But here is what nobody saw coming. This wasn't Trump's endgame. It was just the opening move in a chess game where he planned to sacrifice every piece except the king. Day 2 brought the tariffs. Not economic sanctions against enemies, but threats against America's oldest friends. Britain, Denmark, Canada, nations that have stood with America through every crisis for decades. Countries that sent soldiers to Afghanistan after 9/11s. Allies who've shared intelligence that prevented countless terrorist attacks. Trump was essentially putting a gun on the table and asking, who wants to test me? The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. What do we Brits do? One interviewer asked Starmer, when someone we've thought of as an ally puts a gun on the table. That question captures everything, because this wasn't about Greenland anymore. This was about whether alliances mean anything when power decides it doesn't need them. It was about whether 80 years of partnership could be destroyed by one man's tantrum. Inside NATO headquarters in Brussels, the atmosphere was pure panic. Senior officials were dusting off contingency plans that hadn't been touched since the Cold War. Not plans for Russian aggression, but plans for American abandonment. Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg called 3 emergency meetings in 12 hours. Officials who'd spent careers managing alliance unity suddenly found themselves planning for alliance dissolution. For the first time in NATO's history, European leaders were seriously discussing what the alliance looks like without America. Article 5, the collective defense guarantee that kept Europe safe for generations, suddenly seemed like ancient history. Day 3 brought the meltdown everyone feared but nobody expected. Intelligence sharing between the US and UK didn't just slow down, it nearly stopped completely. 24 T-7SAR teams are exchanging high-level intelligence about threats to each other's countries. Starmer explained. That is keeping everybody watching this program safe. But during those critical hours, that flow became a trickle. American intelligence agencies were reportedly told to reassess its partnerships with countries that weren't showing appropriate respect for presidential decisions. Think about what that means. Terrorist threats, cyber attacks, foreign interference, all the invisible wars being fought every day to keep civilians safe. For 72 hours, that protection was compromised because one man's ego couldn't handle being told no. The human cost was immediate. European security services scrambled to fill gaps in coverage. Flights were quietly diverted. Border security was heightened, and ordinary people going about their daily lives had no idea how close they came to being truly vulnerable. Meanwhile, Trump was doubling down with something that left even his closest allies speechless: the Board of Peace. On paper, it sounded reasonable. a multinational body to help resolve global conflicts, starting with Gaza. But when the membership list leaked at 4:23 p.m. Washington time, seasoned diplomats couldn't believe their eyes. It looks to a lot of people like a cast of Bond villains. One journalist told Starmer during the interview, the comparison wasn't hyperbole, it was genuine terror disguised as dark humor. Vladimir Putin, the man currently bombing Ukrainian cities into rubble, threatening nuclear war and openly calling for regime change in democratic countries, was invited to sit on a peace board, while Ukrainian families huddle in tents inside their frozen homes because Russia destroyed their power grid. Their attacker was being offered a seat at the table to discuss global stability. The psychological warfare was devastating. Putin gets international legitimacy while Ukraine freezes. That is not peace-making. That is rewarding genocide with a promotion. Tony Blair's inclusion added a surreal twist that left even his supporters speechless. The former British Prime Minister, still controversial over Iraq, suddenly found himself grouped with autocrats and strongmen. One Foreign Office insider called it the most bizarre diplomatic lineup since Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt sat together, except this time, Stalin's running the show. But the full list was even worse. Reports suggested representatives from Iran, North Korea, and China. All countries actively working to undermine the Western order. Even Bond villains might blush at this cast. Observers noted, at least fictional villains admit their evil. European leaders watched in horror as their closest ally prepared to hand the world's worst actors a platform for their crimes. Angela Merkel broke her post, retirement silence to call it. A betrayal of everything the West stands for. Emmanuel Macron reportedly threw his phone across his office after reading the list, and they realized something terrifying. America wasn't just abandoning its friends, it was joining their enemies. The country that defeated fascism was now legitimizing authoritarianism. The defender of democracy was now enabling dictatorship. Day 4 brought the economic warfare nobody expected, and it hit harder than anyone imagined. European markets opened in freefall. The FTSE dropped 847 points in the first hour. The DAX collapsed 1,200 points. The KSE lost 934 points. But these weren't just numbers on screens. They represented jobs, pensions, mortgages, the economic security of millions of ordinary people. Currency traders in London, Frankfurt, and Paris watched decades of economic integration crumble in real time. The pound fell 3.2% against the dollar. The euro dropped 2.8%. But the markets were reacting to something deeper than trade threats. They were pricing in the end of the Western order itself. British businesses started making contingency plans that read like wartime preparations. Rolls-Royce began discussing supply chain alternatives. BP started exploring non-American partnerships. Even Tesco was quietly assessing the impact of potential food import disruptions. The psychological damage spread like wildfire. My grandfather fought with the Americans in World War II. One caller told BBC Radio, her voice breaking. He always said they were the most dependable allies you could ask for. Now I don't know what to tell my children about America. That caller captured a generational shift happening in real time. Trust built over 80 years was evaporating in less than a week. And once that trust dies, it takes decades to rebuild. If it can be rebuilt at all. European markets opened in freefall. The mere possibility of American tariffs on NATO allies sent shockwaves through global finance. Currency traders in London, Frankfurt, and Paris watched decades of economic integration crumble in real time, but the markets were reacting to something deeper than trade threats. They were pricing in the end of the Western order itself. When allies become enemies overnight, every assumption about global stability collapses. British businesses started making contingency plans. Supply chains built over generations faced potential disruption. Jobs dependent on transatlantic cooperation hung in the balance. And all because one man decided that threats were more effective than diplomacy. The psychological impact spread beyond governments and markets. Ordinary people across Europe began questioning everything they thought they knew about security and stability. My grandfather fought with the Americans in World War II, one caller told BBC Radio. He always said they were the most dependable allies you could ask for. Now I don't know what to tell my children about America. That caller captured a generational shift happening in real time. Trust built over 80 years was evaporating in less than a week. Day 5 brought either salvation or surrender depending on your perspective. Last night the threat of tariffs was dropped. Starmer announced with barely concealed relief. That is a good thing. But even he seemed unsure whether the crisis was truly over or just temporarily paused. The official narrative was that diplomacy had prevailed. Cooler heads had found common ground. The alliance would survive. But behind the diplomatic language, everyone knew something fundamental had broken. Can we trust him again? Was the question haunting every NATO capital, and nobody had a convincing answer. Because trust isn't just about policies or agreements. Trust is about believing that your ally will stand with you when everything is on the line. After 5 days of threats, ultimatums and casual mentions of invasion, that belief was gone. Starmer tried to project confidence. We end the week in a better place than we started the week. But even he admitted the obvious. NATO, as we understand it, shouldn't be going through episodes like this. The understatement was almost comical. The world's most successful military alliance had nearly collapsed because one member decided to threaten all the others. That is not an episode. That is an existential crisis. European leaders drew their own conclusions. Europe needs to step up, Starmer declared. Not because it is strategically wise, but because America can no longer be counted on to lead. For 70 years, European defense planning assumed American support. Now it assumes American abandonment. That shift changes everything: military budgets, strategic planning, alliance structures, global power balances. We need to be closer to Europe, Starmer continued, revealing how 5 days had accelerated European integration by decades. Brexit suddenly looked like a strategic disaster when faced with American unreliability. The irony is bitter. Trump's pressure tactics achieved the opposite of what he intended. Instead of forcing European submission, he created European independence. Instead of strengthening American dominance, he accelerated American irrelevance. But here is the most chilling part of this entire crisis. This wasn't a one-off meltdown. This was a preview of coming attractions. If Trump can threaten invasion over Greenland, what happens when China moves on Taiwan? If allies become enemies over trade disputes, what happens during actual wars? The precedent is set: alliance commitments are negotiable. Partnership depends on presidential mood. 80 years of collective security can evaporate in less than a week if one leader decides it should. European leaders are drawing up plans for a world where America is not just unreliable, but actively hostile. Not because they want to, but because 5 days of madness proved they have to. Meanwhile, adversaries are taking notes. Putin learned that threatening NATO allies carries no consequences. China learned that American security guarantees are conditional. Every autocrat on Earth learned that democracy's greatest strength, its alliances, is also its greatest weakness. The psychological damage may be irreversible. Even if Trump never threatens invasion again, the knowledge that he could keeps European leaders awake at night. We mustn't let the events of the last week deflect from the focus. Starmer insisted, trying to return attention to Ukraine. But the events of last week changed everything. They proved that the greatest threat to global stability might not come from enemies, but from friends who stop acting friendly. 5 days, that is all it took to prove that 80 years of Western unity could collapse faster than anyone imagined. NATO survived, but barely. The alliance that won the Cold War and maintained global peace for generations nearly died from a single man's megalomania. And the scariest part, this was just the beginning. If 5 days could do this much damage, what will 4 years bring? The heart attack is over, but the patient is still critical. NATO survived, but it is not the same organization it was a week ago. Trust has been replaced by suspicion. Partnership has been replaced by preparation for abandonment. So here is the question everyone's afraid to ask. What happens next time Trump decides to put a gun on the table? Will there be anyone left willing to call his bluff? The answer to that question will determine whether the Western alliance survives the next crisis, or whether 5 days in Greenland becomes the moment historians mark as the beginning of the end. What do you think? Can NATO survive another episode like this? Or is this the beginning of the end for the Western alliance? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if this analysis opened your eyes to what really happened during those 5 critical days, share it with everyone who needs to understand how close we came to losing everything. The mainstream media won't tell you how bad it really got, but we will. Tomorrow, we're breaking down the classified intelligence reports that showed just how panicked NATO leaders really were. Subscribe now because this story is far from over.